Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 19th Claris Community Live. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Alexis Allen from FM Design University to talk about design best practices and how you can make your FileMaker apps more usable and more beautiful. And as we get started, we do, as always, have a couple of questions to share. So I'm going to start those. And to get started today, Alexis wants to know what your level of comfort with design is and who you design your apps for. And so you can get to the poll questions by clicking on the apps or the three little dots with a plus sign down in the lower right, and then choosing Slido, and you should then see those questions. And also, Angie has asked in chat if there's any design that you think is particularly good anywhere out in the world, and I will pull that list together and share it with the other resources in Claris community. So welcome, Alexis.
Hi.
Why don't you, to get started, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we can jump into your presentation.
Sure. I'm Alexis, and I'm the founder of fmdesignuniversity.com. And I've been a FileMaker developer for like a really long time, 25 years or more. And I've always had a passion for design. And I've spoken at Engage a few times on the topic of UI and UX design. So, and also last year, I went to a number of FileMaker conferences around the world and had a really great time meeting people in all kinds of different places, being able to talk about UI UX design. And I'm going to be doing a training day after Engage this year. And so, yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about that and give people a taste, and hopefully they'll be inspired to do more and learn more about UI design after the session.
Excellent. Oh, someone says to Alexis, you've designed your background very well.
Thank you very much. It's really a corner of a little tiny room here. It's all a mess everywhere else, but this part looks good.
All right, I'm just trying to take a look at like our answers. So for the first question of how well do you feel that you know design best practices, we have a beautiful bell curve. About 10% say very well, 28, I'm pretty good, 41%, I'm okay, 20% I'm exploring, and 1% I know nothing.
Oh, okay. So people have a little bit of, mostly have a little bit of knowledge already, which is great.
Yep. And
I think
then
no matter where you fall, though, there's always more to learn. I'm always learning, and that's the power of design as well. There's no like really right answers. There's sort of like better or worse or more usable, less usable. So it's all on a bit of a spectrum. So no matter where you are, I feel like there's always something to learn. And so you don't have to feel bad for not knowing stuff because, there's always something to explore there.
yeah. Yes. And then for the second question of who the audience is for your FileMaker apps, we have about 60% designed for clients, about half designed for coworkers in my company, and 8% say just me. So a good mix of it looks like partners and in-house developers building.
Awesome. Cool.
All right, and I'll leave those up for a little longer, but why don't you take it away?
Do you want me to share my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, and I will drop, someone's looking for your website. I will drop that link. Oh, Angie got it. So we will drop that link into the chat.
Okay, let me just move myself over here. All right, so today I wanted to talk about aesthetics versus functionality because I think it's something that we all kind of struggle with. And, it's relatively fast to make something that's functional, but sometimes it takes a bit more effort to make something that's aesthetic. But I think that over the years, we've kind of realized that aesthetics do matter. The impression that our apps give to our clients and to the people who use them makes a difference about how well received they are and how actually easy to use they are. So the more functional designs, despite the name functional, sometimes they can suffer from usability problems. And so bringing more aesthetics into it can actually improve the usability. So that's why I decided to make this presentation is, to kind of resolve those two things. It's a bit of a spectrum. And I also find that sometimes something is too aesthetic as well, right? You can end up unusable. That's something that's too aesthetic, or you have something that's, super functional, but also not very usable. So there's kind of like this medium ground between aesthetics and functionality is kind of where we want to get to. So we're going to explore those today. But before I get started, I wanted to show you some things that I've actually created, because I know sometimes a lot of my examples are not from the FileMaker world. It's sometimes difficult to find those. But also there's a big wide world of apps out there. Most of them are, web apps or just websites and just digital design in general. So I just start off with a few things that I've created in FileMaker over the years. And these are, some things that I've created for clients of mine. And they kind of try at least to embody that marriage of functionality and aesthetics that I'm going to be talking about today. So I just wanted to start off just with a little bit of background and some interesting little sort of, I'm going to try to bring the themes into the presentation today, which is really about sort of design. So my husband and I own a sailboat. This is a picture of it. And we got it about a year and a half ago or so. We've never been sailors before, particularly, although my husband has a lot of experience, windsurfing, and he's been racing on a sailboat. This is a very old boat. It's about 50 years old. And it's great because, first of all, it was very inexpensive. It's very manual. And it also, because it's old, it's had its scratches and things. And, so we're not too precious about it. So it actually is perfect for us as new boat owners because we're still really learning. And so its aesthetics don't matter quite so much, right? We're happy that it works. It works really well. That's actually really well designed as a vessel. But for us as new boat owners, it's actually perfect for us. We have a friend named Alan, and he has a really, really beautiful boat. It's very new. My husband would be able to tell you all the specs. I don't actually remember all of that, but I did take a tour inside, and it's basically a floating home. There's a beautiful kitchen. There's all kinds of, very mechanical widgets and things that do various things that we have to do manually on our boat. And it can hold many more people. Obviously, you can stay weeks at a time, without having to go to port on this boat. But I would be so stressed out docking this if I could even afford it. But if it was my boat, and especially my first boat, I would just be like, oh my God, what if I got a scratch? It would really be very stressful. So I'm happy to visit Alan on his boat and be like, that's not my problem if something goes wrong. And then there's also, people who have boats like this, which is a very fun event that takes place in Amsterdam. And it is amphibious car boats. And they're basically vintage cars that people have turned into boats, into motorboats. And so they do a bit of a tour. And so this is a different kind of boat. So really, I'm just trying to say that there's all kinds of different ways in which we can sort of deliver the functionality of our apps to our audience. But different people need different things and want different things. And even the aesthetics are different, right? Depending on who the audience is and what their goals are. So obviously someone who's buying an amphibious car boat is really after sort of novelty and attracting attention and doing something fun. It's not so much of something that's functional. Although, obviously you can ride in it if you wanted to. So what I wanted to really talk about first is the functional approach. So I sort of use this image of a barge, which is really just very functional. Not aesthetics do not matter with a barge. It's really about getting all of these containers from one place to another. And this is typically where we are when we're designing for ourselves, right? We kind of know what it is, and so we don't really bother to make it really aesthetic. And so we kind of really lean into that functional side. This can also be something when we're designing for experts. Sometimes we tend to use this functional approach as well, because experts already know what they're doing. And so they don't need sort of those clues about what does this tool do. But the problem is that most of us actually don't have experts as our audience, right? Most of us are designing for average people. So we really have to keep that in mind, is that if we're designing for average people, then we probably need to think more about the aesthetics and the usability. And I think there's a recognition, more and more as apps become sort of more central to our lives, that aesthetics really help to adoption, and it's actually in good business to bring in aesthetics. So, but first, let's just look at some apps that sort of lean into the sort of functional side of things. And this is sometimes called the programmer's interface. We probably recognize, I'm sure I've built something, maybe not quite exactly like this, but something similar in my past. And it kind of happens when you're designing something as you're building it, right? You're not really planning your design out in advance. You're just sort of designing for yourself, or as things occur to you, you plunk them on the screen. And this one happened to have a bunch of annotations, and I think the screenshot was an attempt to explain the interface, but the old joke about interfaces is that if you have to explain it, it's not that good. So, it's just more difficult in some ways because this just adds to the clutter. So what we want to do really is provide patterns for our users to look to, and allow them to recognize more easily what's on the screen and how it goes together. So these patterns should not need annotations, really, right, in an ideal world. And so the more we can sort of design towards that, the sort of more unusable our apps will be. So here's another one. And this is admittedly kind of old style Windows. But to be honest, people were complaining about this when it first came out, like in the early 2000s. People were using this particular screenshot as sort of an example of poor UI design. And as you can see, everything's kind of gray. It's all the same. There are some groups, but there's really nothing sort of making those groups stand out. And I don't know, Rosemary, if you have the ability to ask the question, or I'll just kind of throw it out there. I wonder if people have heard of information architecture before, because to me, what stands out when this particular screenshot and others like it is this lack of information architecture. So do you want me to explain what that is?
Yeah, why don't you? I'm not getting nobody's engaging in chat. I just want to add the thing I remember about this particular design pattern, um, is I remember being in a design workshop when I was still working at Harvard as a FileMaker developer, um, about how tired an ant would get crawling across this.
I love it.
Shadowed, there's so much up and down as you.
It would be like falling in all the check boxes.
Yep. And yes, there's a bunch of people saying, please explain information architecture.
Yeah, okay. So information architecture refers to the structural context of the information contained in the app. So really, it's about labeling, organizing, grouping, creating a visual hierarchy, and all of these things support the usability of apps. It sounds a little bit maybe complicated, but it's really something we interact with every day. So if you think about like a book, right? Nobody has to say, put a field label on the title and go, hey, everybody, this is the title of this book. Hey, everyone, this is the author, right? Maybe you have by, but sometimes you just have a large title and, the author's name, right? And so this is an example of some conventions that have grown up around things like publishing, or let's say, a menu is a really good example, right? A restaurant menu. There's many, many restaurants out there, but the menus are labeled and grouped and constructed in such a way that they're really easily understandable. Now, of course, every restaurant is selling food, and so we don't have to wonder what it is. Apps are obviously more complicated, but we can still use these ideas to help us to organize the information and present it visually in a way that is more organized for people to come away with. So like I said before, we were looking for patterns, right? And so when you set up this information architecture, then you're kind of setting these patterns so that it's more understandable what everything is. And we'll see some examples in a little bit about how this works. Actually, our very next example is really, we want to set up a visual hierarchy, which is kind of our embodiment of our information architecture. It just explains to the users at a glance, how is this information organized, right? So if you see on this particular one, before we go away from it, everything kind of looks the same, right? And everything, like many checkboxes, a lot of sort of a lot of lines. We've sort of come away from this embossed look because we realize it's kind of unnecessarily complicated, so visually kind of complex. So we're trying to really organize and group things. So I like to use Craigslist front page as sort of an example of something that's very functional. It's not very aesthetic, but it is very usable, right? Because the information architecture we were talking about is fairly clear. So I have these groupings, right? The groupings are larger and they have like a bit of a background to them. So it's kind of clear, though this is a heading, and then people can scan the headings in order to see. They don't have to read every single little thing on the screen in order to understand what it is. They can kind of look at the headings and sort of figure out their way through at a glance. And this is a concept I think you can really apply to your own designs right away, is have these clear groupings. And also there's a grid as well, which is kind of helpful as well. This alignment has a very strong alignment. And so everything feels very organized visually. There's none of these drop shadows or lines, right? The separations are really just the white space in between the columns. So, of course, Craigslist, it's a secondhand site, right? So it doesn't have to be super aesthetic. Like you wouldn't expect a design like this for, I don't know, Versace or Gucci or something. I'm sure their website looks very different. But for this particular audience, like I was saying before, you want to have the right tool for the people who are going to be consuming it. It works really well. And of course, Craigslist has been around a long time, like they're from the early internet. They've had a lot of time to do research about who's using our site, what works, what doesn't work. And that's also another theme I wanted to talk about today is like how you have to do that research and figure out, who that audience is so that you kind of understand what people, need from your software. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to me it makes sense. And actually, there's a quick question, and I think maybe you can talk about this later as you talk about best practices toward the end. And there's a little bit of a debate in the chat also about someone said, I struggle with field labels on top, to the left, what works?
It depends probably what you're designing for. For mobile, the consensus is on top. It's easier for people to scan down if the labels are on top and if they are also in one column. So one column on top is sort of the standard that is emerging from eye tracking tests that they've done. So they can sort of do these tests where they bring interfaces up on the screen and then they can ask a bunch of people to interact with them and they can kind of see where their eyes go, and they do that to a large sample of people. And through those tests, what they found is for forms, the labels on top is the clear winner. Not to say I haven't put labels beside, I probably do it quite a bit. So so Wikipedia is another very fun, very functional design. And again, right, it's very clear what is going on here, and every page is the same as every other page. So that brings in another really important design principle, which is consistency, right? So it's predictable and it makes it easy to learn. And then, you have faster ability for people to get through the software because the screens are similar to one another and they're applied consistently. Your styles and your information architecture is the same from page to page. So in Wikipedia, every article is organized more or less the same way, and especially if you're looking at things that are the same type of thing. So all of the countries, for example, or if the person is a notable person, they're all going to have very similar sections, and they make this information architecture very clear. Here's another example of something that is also very functional, still starting to move a little bit towards the aesthetics in that they're bringing in a bit of, icons to sort of as a bit of interest to the group names. But you can see here again all the sorts of things we've been talking about, right? There are separations between each of the groups. There's a strong grouping. It's obvious that it's a group with the label of the group, it stands out. And they're clearer, they're larger and bolder. So there's that contrast between the heading and the content. And that this allows people to scan for the information rather than having to read every single thing. So if you think back to that earlier example, you really have to read all of the labels in order to understand what it's doing and where to go. Whereas with something like this, you're kind of aiding and you're making shortcuts for the user to kind of get through the information. So really, it's simple, consistent, and that makes it easy to understand and easy to learn. So before I go on to the aesthetics, is there any quick questions you want to throw in there?
Yeah, I think someone's asking. No, unfortunately, you cannot send images through chat. But um, feel
You can send a
free
link maybe to
to,
an image.
yeah, if you have a link, or feel free to drop it in the Claris community thread about this episode, where we can maybe share some examples there. Yeah, because someone has asked for example of labels on top versus labels on the left and how you can make it look better. I don't know if you have any to hand, but
Well, I think consistent padding, if you're using labels on top, make sure that the padding and of the label and the padding inside the field are the same so that the start of the text lines up. But it's kind of depends. What I would suggest is, there is a huge variety out there. If you go to Google or Pinterest, you can kind of do a search up and do an image search, and then you'll kind of see the different ways that it's been done, and probably some advice as well about how to do it. I don't have any specifics. It probably depends on what else is on the screen and all those sorts of things. But alignment is really, really helpful. So having good alignment really makes a strong our design stronger, let's say, because it's like tidying up, right? It just, rather than everything looking disorganized, it's more predictable. So that's what I would suggest for that. All right, so let's talk about the aesthetic approach. So often products that are on the aesthetic side, I think I mentioned, Versace or something, right? They tend to be luxury goods. So aesthetic design is usually a mark of quality. But also sometimes it can also be unusable, right? Because it's like so cool that nobody can figure it out. And I have a couple of examples of that. But I just want to make this point that, something that's aesthetic also, it's usually not cheap, right? We don't associate things that are very aesthetic with stuff that's cheap. And so there's something to be said that we have this aesthetic usability effect, actually, where things that also the reverse works, where that association is so strong that we tend to think that things that look good are also easier to use. We ascribe all kinds of like good qualities to something that's aesthetic. And so in a way, we can kind of use this to help us get adoption a little bit better. Sometimes if our thing looks better, then people are more inclined towards it, and so it can help us to have people actually accept our app when we build it, which is a problem sometimes, is to get people to accept something. And so we do want to design things to look good. And as I said before, it is also about usability, because genuinely, when you follow a lot of these principles, you make your product easier to use. But I don't want to say like aesthetics is good and functionality is bad, right? Because we have this sort of thing, which is on the very far side of aesthetics, which is it's called Umi, and I believe it's a conceptual product, but I came across it and I was trying to figure out like, what is it? And I'll just read you the description. It says, Umi redefines digital communication by transforming abstract emotions into tangible experiences, bridging the gap between digital interactions and human touch. So that doesn't really explain what it is either, I don't think. And so, yeah, the lesson here is you can have something that's super aesthetic and really beautiful, but if nobody knows what it does or nobody knows what it is, then it's really not usable, no matter how nice it actually looks, right? Um, Here's another a really wonderful example, which is called the Juicero, and it's basically juice sold in a pouch. It's like not a juice box, but it's like fruits and vegetables that are sealed into like a QR code verified pouch. And this machine costs $700 to squeeze the pouch. But what they decided to do was to save on, like, I guess, engineering and production costs. They decided not to have any physical buttons, and so this juice would machine would only be operated through an iPhone, and it cost $700. I don't know if I mentioned that. And so this was like, funded. It went through all kinds of rounds of testing, but it never took off, right? Because at some point people realized, well, I don't need a machine to squeeze the pouch. I can just squeeze the pouch myself by hand, right? And so this is a classic case of not keeping the users, the actual target audience, at the center of the design. It was really about self-congratulatory, marketing, I guess, or whatever, however it came about. But it wasn't very popular. So even though it looked cool, it was really beautiful, it ultimately kind of failed on the usability front. And so, yeah, it just has the same problem as the other designs we were looking at that were sort of functional, not usable, is not keeping in mind who's the user. So you really need to put yourself in other people's shoes in order to understand what things are like for them. So let's look at apps now. This is an app that I found called a time shifter. I was going to Australia to reconnect last year, and I was really worried about the time shift. I think it's like 14 hours difference for my time zone. And so I went through and I found this app, and I thought, oh, this app is really beautifully designed. It really, all it does is sort of you put in your destination and your home, where your home is, and then it kind of gives you a plan, and you say when you're going to be flying, and it gives you a plan of like when to sleep and when to have light and when you should have coffee or whatever in order to keep yourself awake, in order to kind of shift your time before you leave. So a few days beforehand you can kind of like stay in the dark, and when you get there the effect of the time zone change is not so much. So it doesn't do a lot, which is, an advantage. Obviously, when we're building in FileMaker, we have a situation where a lot of times we have a lot of different things. But I think the lesson here is to really like, if you want to make, especially for mobile, something really usable, is to kind of like pare it down and just don't try to do too much, especially on an iPhone. There's just not the space for it. But they've done such a beautiful job here. They've, they do a lot of what we talked about earlier, which is that information architecture, right? Kind of standing out the flights. You can really easily see the flights there and back. This is actually two flights because I had to go Toronto, Vancouver, Vancouver, Brisbane. So it was two legs, and those are nicely separated. So they've grouped them, right? There's a lot of repetition. So the flights have the same, once they've established that pattern of the flights, they're just repeating it over and over. They have this really subtle use of color and of illustration. It's just really, really well done. And it's very consistent, right? It's very easy to follow what the plan will be. If you compare that with what British Airways gives you, this jet lag advisor, it's just a web page, and it's not even really, it's not even mobile optimized. It's just sort of, here's a web page, you can go to it, good luck, and so which one would you rather use, right? You'd rather use the nicer one and not this one, even though in theory, I guess, this one is functional, right? And so, yeah, so hopefully that example speaks for itself.
Yeah. So my question is, did using the app help you
It
adjust
did.
to the
It
big time
absolutely
difference?
did. Yeah. I stayed in darkness in my room until about noon for a couple of days. I was awake, but I didn't turn on the lights according to the advice of the app. And I was about 2 hours behind. I was waking up, at 5 instead of 7 when I got there, but that was much better than what I was worried about. So I was pretty functional, I would say, and it was a fairly short trip. So yes, it did work.
Very good. I'm just like checking. I just want to call out a couple of things from the comments.
Yeah.
So first, Beverly shared a link to an article called "The Definitive Guide to Form Label Positioning."
Oh, great.
So I will be sure to include that in our resources after the session. Um, so a couple other questions. Is it true that if a user doesn't need an explanation of how to use a screen, it means your design is very good?
Generally speaking, yes, but I think the corollary would be, does that mean we should always aim to design with no explanation required? And that can be a trickier question. So again, it depends who you're designing for. I would say the answer to the user's question or to the member's question is really yes. If they can use it without an explanation, then it's successful. But it depends like what it is. Like if somebody has no knowledge, like let's say you're creating an app for engineers, and somebody doesn't know anything about engineering, well, they're not necessarily going to be able to figure that out, right? So you have to have a match between the audience and then the actual use, the app itself. So it can be a little bit tricky. And a lot of times the sort of the dichotomy is novices versus experts, right? So when someone's a novice at the app, they need more help to understand how it's put together. And then once they're an expert, they can sort of feel like some of these sort of scaffolding things get in their way. Like for example, a simple example would be, let's say you use an app for a first time and there's like a tour, right? The first time you go into the app and there's a tour and you don't know anything, that's helpful. But the 10th time or the 100th time, you don't want to have to go through a tour like every single time, right? And so you kind of have to think about, well, what level of understanding is reasonable to expect from the people who are coming onto this app. And so, you might have a different set of expertise in your ultimate audience. And so you kind of have to take that into consideration as well, because that might make it easier or more difficult for them to understand what the app is doing. So that kind of comes into it. Does that make sense?
Does to me, and I'm like, it's making me think about like the app that I've been immersed in for the last couple of weeks, which is Engage to Go,
Right.
which will be like launching to all the Claris Engage attendees in a few weeks. And yes, there is a tour, but you can also say, never show me the tour again
Yes,
once you've seen
exactly.
it once or twice.
Yeah.
I just want to share one other observation from Christine. She's saying, coming from a graphic artist background, many of these principles are similar to good page layout.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, it's funny. These things are not specific to FileMaker, right? These are just general design principles because, humans are the same. We're the same as we were 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. We really haven't changed in the way that we perceive, the way that we process information. I have a new resource called the Gestalt Design Principles Quick Guide, which are kind of talks about how people perceive, like the science of or in psychology of human perception. And a lot of psychology is involved here too, right? Like decision making and just perception and all kinds of, things, bias. Like there's all kinds of psychological things that go into making an app, but it doesn't matter if you're making a book or a magazine or or an app. Really, the principles are all the same. It's how we're interacting with it that's different. And so obviously in graphic design, you are, there's a certain purpose. It depends. It also depends what you're making. Like, are you making an annual report? Or are you making an ad or something like that? And then again, an app is just another version of that where we're trying to help people get through something. Collecting information is quite difficult because, the person needs to understand what it is that they're putting in, right? So there's a type of conversation with the user as well. And so when we're talking about aesthetics versus functionality, it's like, well, what's the tone of that conversation that we're having with people? Is this a conversation like, give me your data, or is it like, excuse me, would you please put this data in? It's like we're trying to refine the tone of voice that we're using to make it more engaging and make it feel like people are welcomed into our app, and they're not just sort of shoved in there. Oh, no, we open the door and we throw them in and go, okay, give me your information. So yeah, it's a lot of overlap between various designs of various kinds. It's just sort of the final product that's different from it. Okay, so this is just another app as well that is a little more complex. This is sort of things to do. And oh, sorry, no, this one is trained. There's another one that's things to do that's has quite a similar design, but I chose it because it's doing a few more things. It has a bit more complexity, and you're starting to see different design patterns in there, depending on what it is that they are showing you. So each of these three screens, they share some things in terms of like the color is the same, the font is the same, but the pattern, the way that things are displayed is very different between the three of them. But we're still seeing these things like visual hierarchy, right? The information architecture that we were seeing before, the visual design and the aesthetic parts of it are really supporting the usability and supporting the content of the app and making it easier for people to understand what is this app, what is this information that I'm looking at. So there's this judicious use of color, right? There's a little bit of color, not too much, a little bit of images, which is kind of makes it a little bit more interesting. Obviously, they have images that they can use. We don't always have images that are available to us in our apps, but they're using these sort of cards to display to kind of set that information off a little bit. They're using different sizes of type in order to make some things stand out more. So the more important things are larger and they're standing out, and the less important things are smaller. This is really to do with visual hierarchy. And I don't know if I mentioned it already, but I do have a free resource on visual hierarchy as well on my website that people can download if they're interested in getting that. It kind of explains a bit more about visual hierarchy. I'll also be talking about it in the course as well on training day. We'll go kind of in depth into visual hierarchy as well. And this lastly, I just wanted to show you another FileMaker solution that I built, which is actually a little invoicing app, which is for sale, is as a theme. It's called the Confident Theme, and it's also available. But I just wanted to show it because it kind of brings together all of these things that we've been talking about in a FileMaker context. And so, we're trying to use different sizes of type to show the more important stuff is sort of standing out a little bit more. Obviously, in an invoicing, there's no pictures, so we don't have those, but there's just a little bit of color, right? Not too much. I tried to be really restrained with it. You don't need a lot of the time. And I tried to get away from blue because, blue is a great color and it's very useful for a lot of apps, but we see a lot of blue. So I thought, all right, let's do something a little bit different with something that's sort of a non-traditional color. And yeah, so you can sort of see some of these things sort of at play.
And I'm noticing sometimes there are labels on the top and sometimes there are labels on the side to the left.
Yes, that
This
is true.
too.
That is true. Yeah, it depends whether you're displaying or collecting information too sometimes, right? So, but yeah, I think we can probably debate it for a long time whether it should be on the side, and depending on what it is. Yeah, definitely for a portal, you're going to need it on the top because you can't put it on the side, and you wouldn't want to have it repeated and repeated. So, yeah, and sometimes there's also no labels at all, right? That's the other thing is not everything needs a label. Obviously, if you have a bunch of numbers, you need to know what they are, why they're different from one another. But if you have an address, right, that's pretty standard. That's that information architecture we were talking about before. It follows the standard procedure. We don't need to have, oh, here's the street address, here's the name. But the downside is you cannot edit these fields in this view. You have to edit them in a card window, which actually I think is really a good idea. But to separate the browsing of the information and the editing of the information, like to me, it really makes a huge difference because you can collapse the information a lot more. You can save a lot of space and make your layout a lot less cluttered if the editing is happening somewhere else. So yeah. But if you download the Confident theme, you'll see that it's actually a fully functioning FileMaker file. So I put all of that into the file because I kind of struggled for like, people have been asking me for a theme, but like I just don't want to just give like a layout with a bunch of stuff on it because I always struggle with like, well, how do I use these objects? I don't understand how it's supposed to go together. So I thought, all right, I'm going to just create a little app that kind of encapsulates all of these things and shows a lot of the things that I've been talking about, but also they work, right? It's a FileMaker. It's like, this is also practical, right? You can actually also see how it was made. So you can look under the hood and, adapt it for your own use as well.
All right, I just got a couple of comments have come in. I just want to, first of all, just to Michael and Preben, you both sent me things privately. If you could resend those to everyone so everyone can get the benefit of seeing what you're saying. And like a question of, is there a guideline for when to use capital letters and when not to use capital letters?
I guess I will tend to use all caps sometimes for labels and things, but there's been a bit of a debate of whether they're more or less difficult to read. The thing about capitals is they have a tendency, if you're using them in sort of anything that's more than a word or two, they have this tendency of looking like you're shouting. And so, you have to be careful of that. On the other hand, sometimes it's helpful to have all caps as a contrast to an upper lower case, for example, right? So let's say you have two pieces of information. You don't really want to change the size of them, but you want to make them different somehow. You can use capitals versus lowercase or upper lower. The problem is though that if they're really big, like their impact is going to be even more, and so it's going to seem even more like you're shouting. So you kind of have to be judicious about like where do you use them. I certainly wouldn't use them for anything that's like a large piece of text, or unless it's like a warning or something, you have a sentence or something that's like you want it to stand out. So that would probably be where I would use them, but it's generally speaking, we try to stick with upper lower just because it's a bit easier to read, and it just doesn't seem like you're yelling at the user.
Yeah, and like
Any other?
Yeah,
Go
one
ahead.
other question is, I think going back to your Confident theme, I see a lot of different styles, And I remember learning print media rules that said no more than 3.
Styles.
Yeah, I think that's what that is. So how do you apply,
I definitely
the
have
wind
more
is,
than 3.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think there's a lot of styles and they're all for different reasons. I don't like, oh, I'm just going to create a bunch of styles and then I'll see if I use them. Like I always create a style because I've come across some piece of information that I need to display in a certain way. And so then I create a style for it. So, we have these buttons that are, um, different styles. You have like, so for example, the little metadata that tells you how many items there are above there. I mean, you might be able to cut down the styles themselves, but to me, it doesn't really make sense because like the styles don't take up a lot of space. And I think that they add something in terms of being um, differentiating the information. Then you can reuse them in different places when you need that type of information. Again, if I'm going to have this item count on a lot of different portals throughout my system, then I can just reuse the same thing again and again. What I didn't do though is it's all one font. It's still the same typeface for everything, right? So that kind of lends a bit of unity to it as well, which is another design principle, is that things look more unified because I'm not like mixing and matching different font styles and different typefaces. The other thing too is, as we know, sadly, in FileMaker, it's hard to get like true cross-platform typefaces. So we only have a few typefaces that are super reliable. And so one of the ways we can add variety is by changing the size, maybe changing the color of them, like dark versus gray or whatever, and changing like bold versus regular. So that's another way to add contrast without sort of adding, the glitz of a bunch of funky fonts or something like that. So yeah, definitely more than 3.
Yeah. All right. And I'll just call out to anyone who's not watching the chat that Preben shared a project with pretty good UI that he did in FileMaker. So the website is Danish, but you can take a look at the screenshots to see for more inspiration.
Awesome.
Right.
Okay, so how do we do it basically? There's like how do we harness the wind of this? The first thing really is like simplicity. And so it's really about kind of distilling it down to what are we doing? A lot of times what I see in the functional apps is that what happens is you're trying to do too much, right? There's like so many different focuses and so many things on the screen that are trying to all compete for attention that's part of what makes it difficult to understand. And so when we can simplify, that really makes a huge difference. And the thing is, you don't want to simplify or compromise the functionality for the sake of the aesthetics, but you do want to sort of try and make your UI as attractive as possible. And one of the ways is to kind of just focus on a few things at a time, especially on mobile, but this is also applicable on desktop as well. So you want to make it as simple as possible, but no simpler, if that makes sense, right? So what can we take away? What can we remove? What can we move off the screen that doesn't relate to what the user's doing at this exact moment? This is Ulysses, which is a writing app, which kind of is really the purpose of it is to really sort of focus on your writing, and it has a fairly simple design. And what you can see is there's very few lines. Like if we compare this, your ant, if your ant was walking across the screen here, there wouldn't be much for it. It would be weaving between the paragraphs or whatever, but it wouldn't be bumping up against all of those lines that we were looking at before. There are some subtle lines, but they're using white space, which is another visual design principle we can use to kind of make things look more modern. That's another kind of hallmark of more modern designs is everything is more further apart. Partially because we have bigger screens now, right? Well, I mean, not mobile, but but for desktop and stuff, right? We have more space that we can play with, so there's less of a feeling of, oh, we need to scrunch all of these things. But we also have things like popovers and card windows that we can use to bring functionality with a single click to the user without having to have everything on the screen, right? It's like what we were talking about before, where you can't necessarily edit in browse mode, but you can edit in another screen where you can give all the space that you want. You can put the labels where it's most beneficial for the users to read them, and then have them go through it. And then they close that down, and then you can display it in a very small chunk. Right. And it's also about removing stuff that's not related to the main goal of the layout. So what can you take away, right, until you're starting to compromise the understanding of this layout? And that's kind of your point at which you want to kind of stop. And really the only way to kind of know what to keep and what to take away is to research, is to talk to your users. And you can do interviews, you can talk to them and sort of talk to the people who are actually doing the job. A lot of times we deal with sort of stakeholders, maybe their business stakeholders or their clients, or someone who's footing the bill, but they're maybe not the person actually doing the work. And their perspective is very different, right? People who are looking for a redesign, maybe trying to increase, their productivity or reduce the number of errors or whatnot. People doing the work are trying to get their work done. And so what does that look like for them? You talk to them and see. Now, the only downside of talking to people is sometimes they don't actually know. Like, I do a lot in a day and I don't always remember what the steps are, especially if it's something that I'm familiar with. I might kind of forget. And so when you speak with people, sometimes there's a lot left out of that conversation. And so sometimes it's good to ask people to show you, could you show me how to create an order? Like, how do I do that? And try to avoid like just yes or no questions, because like that just doesn't lead anywhere. If you have an open-ended question, what are your pain points around your daily work or whatever it is, tailored to whatever their role is, that will give you some clues about, oh, what are they struggling with? What are the problems? Like, why are there errors? Well, there are errors because they're struggling with this issue where they, there's a disconnect between them and production or whatever. And so like, how can your app kind of fill that gap and make it easier for them to kind of get past that pain point? So yeah, be careful about the yes or no question, because you might not really get anywhere. And the other thing is, what I really suggest is to make prototypes of your design or mock-ups of your design before you start developing. This is a paper prototype, so this is very simple. This is the simplest level of prototyping that you could do, which is basically just to kind of get some pieces of paper and kind of lay it out on, or even sticky notes, right? And just try to say, okay, this is how I think it's going to work. Like, does this make sense? But there's lots of mock-up tools out there. There's Balsamiq, there's Figma. I used to use Adobe XD, but that's gotten into maintenance mode now. And there's a whole raft of other ones that are less well known. Sketch, which is Mac only, but there's a whole bunch of others that are kind of out there as well. And it doesn't matter so much. It's just whatever you're comfortable with. But I really encourage people to kind of do some design ahead of time. We saw at the beginning that programmer's interface where you're kind of building it as you go. And that's when that happens. You're just sort of like throwing things on the screen as they occur to you. You kind of want to give it some thought, especially when you're designing for other people who are not you, which is most of us.
I just want to like interrupt there.
Yeah.
Couple things. Solomon says prototyping on paper is underrated.
Yeah.
Cheap,
Yeah.
easy, fast, gets your creative juices flowing. And Albert asked, what do you think of Figma?
I like Figma actually. I think it's really useful. I've been doing an entire redesign lately in it, and there's like one feature that Figma doesn't have that Adobe XD used to have, which is a repeat grid. So you could take like a few objects and then kind of just make them repeat over and over again in Adobe XD really easily. But other than that, they're pretty neck and neck in terms of functionality. And it's a little bit different. And actually, I'm working on a free Figma course right now, a very simple course to help people kind of learn Figma from the ground up, because I had to do it. And there was a couple things about it that I found as a FileMaker developer, they don't represent them quite the same way. So you're trying to figure out, well, how does this relate to a button, for example, in my FileMaker solution? So that'll be coming soon. And so I hope more people will use it. I think, as I said, I don't think it matters so much what the tool is. It's really just the idea of walking through what you're planning to build and verifying your designs kind of before you commit to development. Because it's a lot cheaper. Like somebody was saying, paper prototyping, it's cheap, right? Like in an hour or two, you can get an idea of where you're going and just save yourself the trouble of going down the wrong path. Or you get to development and you're like, oh, I wonder what I should do here, to go back to the client, ask the questions, and maybe what you've already done is like down the wrong track. So like you just save all of that and like plan it out ahead of time, and that will just save you a lot of trouble.
Any other questions? I mean, we are just telling everybody we're coming up to the end of our hour. If you haven't already, please jump in and answer our closing questions, which are what's one improvement you are inspired to make to your apps as a result of attending today? And the second is, are you inspired to learn more about effective design? So please jump in there. And I just have a word cloud up. I'm looking at it right now of the improvements. And so far, simplicity and simple are winning, are the big words. But there's a lot of themes around white space, grouping, readability.
Absolutely, great. And information architecture, hopefully, these are all aspects of information architecture. So indirectly, yeah. Do you want me to just finish this off, Rosemary?
Yeah, and then I've got a good question for you at the end here.
Okay, so really, I've talked about information architecture already. It's really about kind of trying to figure out what that is, like what is the structure of my information and how can I communicate that to my audience, especially using visual hierarchy. And we've seen that in a bunch of our examples today. This is a good example, I think, of a very functional app that kind of tries to do it well, where you've got, contrast and between the headings and the content. You've got different sizes of text to communicate different kinds of information. So really think about, well, how can I make it easy for the user to kind of understand what are the elements that are contained here? What is the data structure and relationship between them? And then the last kind of point is really about consistency, is kind of once you've set all this up, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. You can kind of reuse that over and over again. And actually that makes it seem more intuitive, right? Because every new screen they see is not like completely different from the last. And so that increases the user's trust also in your design when it's consistent. We have this is not our marina, but we have one that's very similar. They all kind of work the same way. You've got a dock, right? And you park, and usually there's a little strip between two boats so that you can get off your boat and walk into the main dock. But once you've learned how one works, right, then they all kind of work the same way. And it's the same sort of thing with app design. So once you have that way of presenting the information, just kind of use it consistently over and over. And that kind of lends naturally an aesthetic approach, because it kind of it increases whatever it is that you've done, and it improves the aesthetics without having to like add more stuff. So we want to avoid this, which is the word tab, with every tab, every little toolbar, expanded, and kind of try to move more towards something like this. And this isn't like I'm not saying this is the be all and end all of design by any means, but that's the beauty of it. There's like so many possibilities out there, right? Everyone has their own approach. Everyone's unique. And we said at the beginning, if you're just learning, that's cool. You've just got more to explore, and everyone can learn. And there's there's not right answers in the same way as there is with scripting, but there's definitely more usable. And that's kind of where we want to go towards. Like, how can we make this more usable? How can we help the people that we're there to serve more easily and more effectively?
Right. And like one last question, unless more come in. Um, Eric asked, how much effort should I put into building themes and styles and templates in FileMakers, rather than just individually editing individual display elements?
I would definitely make styles. So I try to make a style for every component, or a part of a component, I should say. So like a component might be like the portal header. So there might be a shape that's the portal header, and there might be like a label that's the portal header. It might be a left aligned and a right aligned. So all of those could have different styles, obviously, because they have different attributes, but they would all go into like the portal header component. So as soon as I create something that I get to a situation where I need a different kind of display, then I would create a style. It's much easier to do it at the beginning, at the start. I don't know, Rosemary, if you have a link to the last year's Engage presentation that's all about themes and styles. And so the local formatting, when you change an object locally, will add CSS to that object in the background. And that's not really a problem if you have one or two objects, but sometimes people never use styles. And so there's think about how many layouts do you have? How many objects on how many layouts? In my presentation, you can see all of the attributes that can possibly get filled, right? It's really quite astounding how much could be there. And so like it's just sort of a level of kind of volume. So a little bit of local styling isn't really going to make a huge difference. But if you don't use styles regularly and keep them updated, then it can have a significant effect on the loading of your layouts and stuff. So everywhere we can kind of optimize and just use sort of best practices without having to worry about making decisions, just sort of do it and it becomes a habit. And then that's just how you design, right? That's just how you develop your solution. And then you don't have to worry about it. It's much harder if you already have a solution that has no styles and then you have to go through all of the layouts. It's a little bit more difficult. It can still be done, but it's a bit harder to do it that way.
Yeah, and there was a couple other comments to add on there. And I think they mostly came just to me. But for performance reasons, definitely use styles, especially if you've got complex layouts and a distributed user base over a wide area network or web direct, because every individually styled element on your layout is adding CSS load to your layouts, which means that your network performance can get really slow really quickly. And I think Alexis's session last year did a great job on that. And many, many years ago, back when we first introduced themes and styles, one of the FileMaker engineers did a really good session and really illustrated how that weight has. So I will try to dig up a link to that recording and also share it with the resources if I can even still find it.
Well, I looked at that recording when I developed my last year's presentation, and so it was inspiring to me to kind of show something similar. So it's not quite the same presentation, but it has some similar information and kind of makes the same point of like, yeah, it can get really heavy, especially like you said, if you are in any sort of challenging environment where the network speed is not great. Like there's a lot of things that can hide when we're like in the office with two people, and then suddenly you are delivering a solution to a bunch of people, 100 users across the web. It's a different situation.
Yeah. I'm just doing a quick scan for any more questions. One observation, I think maybe this is some feedback that you can take back for future presentations, is would have loved to see your rework of some of those ugly design principles.
I have them in my, I think in my original presentation, I had it, but I didn't put it in for today. So I do have a couple of those that I've shown before. Yeah, can be quite traumatic. Not those specific ones, but other redesigns that I've done for clients. And yeah, it's like, whoa.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think we're out of time. I just want to share going back to the word cloud of improvements. Looks like simplicity is the big winner. Like there's
Awesome.
many variations on that. And more than half are inspired to learn more about
Great.
design principles. And so that's about almost 60%, and 40% say somewhat. So I think, everybody is inspired to at least learn a little bit more. So
That's
I
great.
think we've achieved our goal. So thank you for joining us. I can't wait to see you at at Claris Engage next month.
Absolutely.
Yes, and just a reminder to everyone, we will not be having any community lives next month as we are in the final preparation for for Engage. But we will be back in April and have a great calendar planned for April, May, and June. So thank you, and please check out the community discussion for links back to any of the resources you may have missed and to share your examples. So, thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
It's
Rosemary.
great to see you.